Wouldn't it be nice to listen to the music stored on your phone or iPod through your car's factory audio system? In this video, I'll show you how to do that. If you own a Ford vehicle and it has a radio with a plug that looks like this and a wire plugging into the back of the radio that looks like this, you are a very lucky man or woman. With less than $10 in parts and a little bit of time, you can modify your car's factory audio system to accept an auxiliary input so that you can play your iPod, iPhone, BlackBerry, or similar device through your car's factory audio system while keeping the stock stereo. Your car's audio system works as follows. The radio emits a low-level audio output that travels through a wire to an amplifier, usually located in the trunk of the car. This amplifier adds power to this low-level audio signal so that it can be heard through the speakers throughout the vehicle. In order to modify this system to accept an external audio source like an iPod, we need to cut the low-level audio wire and reroute it to a switch. We wire our external audio source to the switch, and the switch will choose whether to send the signal from the radio to the amplifier or to send the signal from the iPod to the amplifier. On the back of your radio, you'll notice there are multiple plugs, but the one we are concerned with is this one. This is the low-level audio output. You'll notice there are 8 pins, and the signal that comes from these 8 pins is the signal that must be intercepted in order to add an external audio source. The type of switch that will allow us to intercept this signal and replace it with an external audio source is a double throw switch. A double throw switch is a 2-position switch that, when in one position, will allow us to listen to the radio, and when in another position will allow us to listen to the external audio signal. Ideally, we would need something called an 8-pole double throw switch because there are 8 pins in this plug. That 8-pole switch would, when in one position, allow the signal to pass through from this plug directly to the amplifier, and when in the second position, allow the signal from the external audio to go to the amplifier. I couldn't find an 8-pole double throw switch. The best I could find at Radio Shack was a double pole double throw switch. These will work, but we need 4 of them because we need to hijack all 8 of these pins and replace them with the signal from our external audio. Now that we know the basics of how our system's going to operate, let's start building it. Ideally, we need an 8-pole double throw switch. Because I couldn't find one, I need to make do with 4 double pole double throw switches. If you can find 4-pole double throw switches, you would only need 2. But again, if you could find an 8-pole double throw switch, you would only need to switch one little slider to go from auxiliary audio input to radio and back again. But these were cheap and easy to find, so that's what we're going to use. I think I want to mount the switches in the ashtray of the car. I don't smoke, so it's only used for change at this point. I have 3 cents. I also have a piece of color matched plastic from an old sun visor that is the same color as the interior of the car. I think I'll cut a piece of this plastic to go into the ashtray, and I can mount the switches to the plastic. Mirror, mirror, now you break. So some cutting needs to be done. I used my hacksaw to cut the right sized plastic ashtray insert switch mounting plate. It's going to stay in the ashtray like that, and then we'll mount the switches right here. I drilled 2 small holes with a drill and used some very small screws to secure the plastic piece into the ashtray. Now we just need to cut out a rectangular hole just large enough for our switches. I cut out the proper sized hole for the switches. To do it, I used a utility knife, but I heated the utility knife with a torch, so it cut the plastic a little bit better. I was able to find 8 matching screws in my workshop, so I mounted the switches to this plastic plate, and that's what it's going to look like inside the car. Now that our fabrication is done, it's time to start wiring. The middle row of terminals will be the output to the car's amplifier. The other 2 rows will be the inputs from either the car's original radio or the external audio device. You can wire these switches in one of 2 ways. One method requires going to your car and cutting this gray wire, wiring one end of it to this row of terminals on the switches, wiring the other end of it, which would still be in the car, to the middle row of terminals, and wiring your external audio source wire to the 3rd row of terminals. This obviously requires cutting your car's factory wiring. If you have access to an extra plug with a wire on it and an extra radio with this plug like this, you can do this modification without cutting into the car's wiring. This is the method I'm going to use because I don't want to cut any of my car's original wiring. This is an old non-working radio with the plug that I need. I'm cutting this ribbon of wires so I can access the plug that I need. Now I will just use a small Torx driver to remove this screw and this screw. There's actually 3 screws I need to remove to access this plug. Just to clarify, this isn't necessary to do this modification. If you don't have access to a second-hand radio and extra wires and plugs, you can just cut your car's factory plug and still achieve the modification. The only downfall is that you will have cut your car's original factory wiring. So don't do this to the radio that you plan on using in your vehicle. I've loosened all of the screws, so now I can remove these plugs. And this is the one that I need. And I'll solder onto the back. This is a diagram of the pinout of this plug. The speakers are arranged plus and minus. Here is one speaker, plus minus here is another speaker. That's the left side. Then the right side is here, the front and rear. I want each switch to control one speaker. So I'll go to the back of this plug and use some telephone wire and just start soldering to these terminals right here, which is the back of this plug. The telephone wire I'm using for this has 4 wires in it, so I'm going to use 2 pieces. 4 of the wires will go on the left channel and 4 of them on the right channel. I've attached these 4. Now I'll just duplicate it on this other side. I soldered the other telephone wire to the back of the plug, and now I need to solder the other ends of the wires to the switches. This is the right channel input to the amplifier. This is the left channel input to the amplifier. So we'll solder these to this middle row of terminals on the switches. Now that I have the wires attached to the back of this plug, I'm going to use a zip tie and tie the wires both to each other and to the printed circuit board in order to secure them, because I don't want these solder joints to come undone in the future. Now, because of this cable tie, if these wires are pulled on, no stress is exerted on these weak solder joints. Next, I've applied electrical tape to the entire assembly, taking care not to cover up the plug that's necessary for operation. The tape prevents the metal terminals coming in contact with the chassis of the car or any other voltage source. The next step is to solder these wires to the switches that will select the input. It's important to know which terminal on the plug the wires correspond to. So either take note of the wire colors before you add the tape to the plug, or use a continuity tester to determine which wire corresponds to which terminal. Once you've determined which wire goes to what terminal, you can then figure out which wire corresponds to what channel and which polarity. I want each switch to control an individual speaker in the car. I've made a note that the left side terminal of each switch will be the positive lead and the right side terminal will be the negative. So the next step is to solder the appropriate wires to the appropriate terminals on the switch. You could also use crimp-on slide connectors on the ends of these wires. They might be helpful in running the wiring through the car when this project is finished. But in this application, I'm just going to solder the wires directly to the backs of the switches. Since I'm mounting these switches in the ashtray of my car, it was necessary for me to drill a hole in the back of the ashtray and run the wires through the hole prior to soldering. Now that I've soldered the output wires that take the signal to the amplifier, I'll connect the wires that are carried from the radio through this plug. I've used my continuity tester to determine which colored wire goes to which terminal on my switches, and I've marked them on this sheet of paper. Because this wire is too short to go all the way from the ashtray to the stereo in the car, I'll have to use some jumper wires. So I'll solder these jumper wires to these wires from this plug, and the other end of the jumpers will be connected to the first set of inputs on these switches. This is what it looks like with the wires from the plug coming out of the radio soldered to these jumper wires to lengthen this cord in through the back of my ashtray and into one of the input sides of the switches. The best way to insulate this connection between the plug and these extension wires would be heat shrink tubing. However, I've already spent almost $7 on this project, and I don't want to spend any more money on heat shrink tubing. So instead, I've just taped the individual solder joints, and then I'm going to tape the wires all together. I've now completed the wiring for the audio signal from the car's stereo through this plug into the switches, and the wiring for the audio signal out of the switches to the car's amplifier through this plug. The only thing left to do is to add the second input through this last remaining row of terminals that will be the signal from the external audio device. To complete the wiring for the second input, the external audio source, you'll need a 3.5mm stereo plug with a length of cable. Cut and strip the wires at the end of the cable, and these will be our input into the switches. You'll notice that the stereo cable has 3 wires, and our switches have 8 terminals. That's because the factory stereo uses a 4-channel configuration with independent positive and negative inputs. This stereo cable is a 2-channel configuration with a common negative. In order to convert the 2-channel common negative stereo cable to the 4-channel independent negative configuration that's used on the factory stereo, we need to connect all 4 of the negative terminals on these switches and connect that wire to the negative wire on the stereo cable. We also need to connect the positive front and rear terminals on the right and left channels and connect those 2 wires to the positive inputs on the stereo cable. I've now connected all of the negative terminals of these switches to the negative wire on the stereo cable. I've just finished connecting the right and left input wires from the stereo cable. As you can see, the right channel is connected to both the front and rear switch, as is the left channel, and all of the negative terminals are interconnected. Now we just need to plug it in and see if it works. Hopefully nothing catches on fire or blows up. This is what the finished product looks like. A set of switches, an input for an external audio device, the output to the amplifier, and the input from the car's factory stereo. Now it's time to plug everything in. I've connected the radio input plug of our switches to the back of the radio, and I've connected the existing plug that goes to the car's amplifier to our output side of the switch. Now we can just reinstall the radio and plug in our external audio source to the 3.5mm jack, and the project will be complete. Here's how the finished product looks installed in my car. I have the switches mounted in the ashtray with the external audio cable hooked to my phone. So if we are listening to the radio, all we need to do is flip the switches and we can listen to whatever is on the phone or MP3 player.
Yes! Here comes Amos! Amos Moses was a king.
And then to switch back to radio, we just push the switches back. Thanks for watching.